Hey guys, this is Vidhi Dwivedi, and for CAS475, I'll be presenting on Sojourner Truth. So before we get into the details of the speech and kind of analyze it, we're going to go through her biography, a little bit of history about what's going on in the country, and then we're going to dive into her speech. So that's Sojourner Truth on our right. Her name was actually Isabella Baumfree, and she was born in New York in 1797. And according to Margaret Washington, writing for the Journal of African American History, she was actually enslaved for 18 years by rural and land-rich Hudson Valley Dutch family. In 1826, she took her freedom 1 year before the New York statute would emancipate her. And according to Neil Painter, writing for the Journal of American History, which was published in 1994, she changed her name to Sojourner Truth on the first day of June in 1843. One of the reasons why I wanted to include this is because her faith was a very big part of her life. And that day, when she decided to change her name, was the first day of June, which was the day of Pentecost, and that is the Christian holiday that falls 50 days after Easter. And that day commemorates the Holy Spirit filling Jesus' disciples and giving them the power to preach to strangers. So this was a really significant day for her, and for her to change her name to Sojourner Truth. She also had a family. She had 5 children according to our textbook, but in her speech she mentions she had 13 children. So this is something that's still a little blurred in that sense, but I wanted to mention that obviously. So a little history about what was going on in the country. So in 1808, legislation was passed to ban importation of slaves into the United States. And according to my calculation, that is the same year Sojourner Truth was enslaved in New York. So they wanted to stop trading slaves from the African continent and anywhere else, but in the country, slave trade was still going on. Slavery was abolished in New York in July of 1827, and as we all know, Sojourner Truth was emancipated in 1826. The 13th Amendment goes into effect in 1865, which abolishes slavery throughout the United States. Now we're going to go into some history regarding the women's rights movement. So in 1840, which is according to Douglas Maynard, writing for the Mississippi Valley Historical Review, which was published in 1960, he mentions that in 1840, Lucretta Mott and Katie Stanton, 2 female abolitionists, aren't allowed into the General Anti-Slavery Convention in London, and that basically just encourages them to hold a women's rights convention. According to Pratima Arora, which was writing for Economic and Political Weekly, published in 2003, she writes about 1848 and the Seneca Falls Convention, which takes place, where the women's suffrage resolution is passed. This sets precedent for what's to come in the future. And the basic understanding of the Declaration of Resolution was these women and men coming together to write it down, a little bill protesting women's inferior legal status and listing 11 resolutions for moral, economic, and political equality of women, amongst everything else written in there. In 1851, which is the part that we're going to be covering, the Ohio Women's Rights Convention takes place and is attended by Katie Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, and Sojourner Truth, which is when she gives her historical speech. So, now we're going to get into the speech, Ain't I a Woman? And I'm just going to section off the speech and we're just going to discuss what I took out from it. So I'm not going to read this out for you, so I'll just give you some time to read this part of the speech, and then I'll kind of analyze the themes and what's going on. So Truth speaks regarding women's rights, but also heavily includes her racial identity, because she is a woman, but she is a black woman first. She gives examples of the labor and pain that she went through during her enslavement. She doesn't separate her 2 identities, because at that time slavery had yet to be abolished, and women, mostly white, were also advocating for women's rights. And they were at the forefront of this movement, but they were forgetting about Black women who were still suffering by being left out from a movement that was supposed to provide equal rights to them regardless of their race. So being a Black woman kind of was a setback at that time. So she kind of gave them a platform by doing a speech there. This provides foresight in the way the government would pass the 15th Amendment in 1870, providing rights for only Black men to vote. This is also when Frederick Douglass, who was a public supporter of women's rights, disagreed with the women's suffragists, as he believed that the enfranchisement of the Black community was urgently needed and didn't want to miss on the opportunity for change. He did eventually reunite with Stanton and Anthony for universal enfranchisement years later, but as you can see, the men that were a part of this movement obviously favored enfranchisement for Black men before women would get the legal status to vote. So the second part of the speech, which I'm going to let you all read, she also just takes a jab at the intellect part of this speech in what I believe is a personal choice. So Sojourner was illiterate, and although this speech may seem refined to us, it's been so because all these past years her speech has gone through various revisions as it was published. She spoke standard English, and she spoke in such a way that let people understand what she was saying. So, representing truth, Sojourner's Truth, Knowing and Becoming Known, a journal article written by Neil Painter talks about Frederick Douglass, which I've mentioned in our slide before. Frederick Douglass, who escaped from slavery in 1838, taught himself the language to show that he was a man of cultivation and refinement, that his escape from slavery was successful, and that he was successful only because he was literate. Essentially, he kind of thought that slavery and illiteracy were associated. And Sojourner and Douglass were acquainted with each other. So I believe that the wording of this particular section was to show that such literacy has nothing to do with the empowerment of women's rights and for the rights of Black people. So, third part of our speech and analysis. I'll let you all read this part, and then I'll continue on to this. So before she ends her speech, she says that, and of course she makes reference to her faith because it was a big part of her, that she talks about that demonstrating that the start of the civilization, the Jesus that everybody speaks of, the Jesus that helped others and changed the world, was birthed by a woman, and without a woman, Jesus wouldn't be here. And therefore, that if such a powerful first woman existed, it is only normal for them to be treated equally in this world. And that's what's very important to me, she includes all parts of her identities and brings it in together to showcase how truthful and how personal this is to her. So now I'm going to be kind of just going into the importance of this speech for us. So she uses a lot of repetition, ain't I a woman, ain't I a woman, ain't I a woman, as you can read it. And she uses very simple English, which creates long-lasting impact. People from all backgrounds were able to understand her speech. And by using this repetition, it further cemented her claim and brought a more emotional feeling to those listening. Moreover, she's also credible, especially when bringing up her past of slavery, because she has also done every type of harsh work a man has done, but she also implies that she has withstood racial discrimination that came with it, and talks about the over-sexualization of a Black woman as well when she talks about her 13 children, as we will read in the speech. So everything just layers up and is just a culmination of how important this movement was for her. Moreover, as a Black Black feminists at the forefront of a movement. Her presence at this convention not only gave space for Black women to be involved in this fight, but it also allowed them to imagine themselves on the platform she stood on. So I feel like as a she was a great option for representation, and she spoke what she believed in, and she gave that encouragement to those watching, especially Black women who were fighting, who weren't at the forefront of the movement. Seeing her on that stage, I feel like that really cemented in their hearts that they could be there and they could fight for their rights too. And this is just our reference page in addition to Lend Me Your Eyes, which is the book we read for our speech. And I hope you all enjoyed this. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you guys in class. Thank you.